The uproar began with a single clip filmed from the crowded stands of the US Open. The video was shaky, recorded on a fan's phone, but it showed enough to spark a storm. A child, barely old enough to reach over the barrier, held out his hat in excitement as a player approached after the match. Before the boy could get an autograph, a man in an expensive suit leaned in, grabbed the hat from his hands, and walked away without a word. Gasps echoed in the crowd, and someone shouted in disbelief. Within hours, the footage was online, and within days it had been seen by millions. The man was quickly identified, not as a random spectator, but as the CEO of a well-known company. The public reaction was swift and merciless. Headlines branded him the hat snatcher of the US Open. Comment sections filled with outrage, parents condemning him for humiliating a child, and fans calling for boycotts of his company. The story struck a nerve because it combined two powerful images: the innocence of a child and the arrogance of power. To many, the CEO became the embodiment of entitlement, someone who believed he could take whatever he wanted simply because of his position. At first, he remained silent. His company's press team issued no statements, his social media accounts went dark, and his public appearances were canceled. Silence, however, only fueled speculation. People assumed he was hiding, too ashamed to face the consequences. Memes circulated endlessly, mocking him in exaggerated cartoons where he stole not just hats, but toys, ice cream, and even Christmas presents. For weeks, the CEO's name was less associated with his business achievements and more with the humiliating label of hat thief. Inside the company, the fallout was severe. Stock prices wavered as investors worried about the brand's reputation. Employees faced uncomfortable questions from friends and family. Some customers canceled contracts, unwilling to be tied to a company led by someone who could treat a child so cruelly. The board of directors, under immense pressure, demanded answers. Yet the CEO remained withdrawn, refusing interviews and avoiding public appearances. His silence was strategic, guided by lawyers who warned him that speaking too soon could worsen the damage. But to the outside world, it looked like cowardice. Behind the scenes, those closest to him described a man unraveling under the weight of his mistake. He replayed the video again and again, searching for ways to justify what he had done. To him, it had been a misunderstanding. He claimed he thought the hat belonged to a corporate partner sitting nearby, that he had reached for it without realizing it was a child's prized possession. But no explanation seemed strong enough to erase the image of a powerful man taking something from a kid and walking away smugly. The breaking point came when the child's family appeared on national television. The boy, holding back tears, described how excited he had been to meet his favorite player, only for the moment to be ruined. His parents, visibly angry, demanded accountability. The sight of the child's crushed expression hardened public opinion even further. Viewers who had once laughed at the memes now seethed with genuine anger. The pressure was unbearable, and finally, the CEO had no choice but to respond. When he broke his silence, it was in a carefully staged press conference. Cameras crowded the room, microphones pointed in his direction, reporters eager to capture every word. He sat stiffly at the table, the weight of weeks of outrage visible in his posture. His opening words were slow and deliberate. He admitted to being the man in the video, acknowledged that he had taken the hat, and called it the biggest mistake of his career. He apologized directly to the child and his family, promising to make amends. But apologies in the digital age are fragile things. Some saw sincerity in his words, while others dismissed them as nothing more than damage control. The silence had been broken, but the question remained, would the apology be enough to repair the damage, or had the CEO's name been permanently branded by one reckless act? The apology might have been delivered, but the aftermath was far from over. As soon as the press conference ended, social media exploded with reactions. Clips of the CEO's statement were sliced into short, dramatic segments, each one interpreted differently depending on who shared it. Some praised him for finally facing the cameras and admitting fault. Others mocked his tone, claiming he looked more worried about his company's image than about the boy whose dream he had shattered. Memes returned in full force, this time featuring screenshots of him at the podium, his stiff posture compared to that of disgraced public figures from scandals past. The boy's family released a short statement the next day, acknowledging the CEO's apology, but emphasizing that forgiveness would not come so easily. Our son lost a moment he had dreamed about for months. The statement read, "A public apology does not erase that." This fueled even more debate online. Supporters of the family called the CEO's gesture hollow, while others argued that everyone makes mistakes and he should be allowed to move on. What was clear, however, was that the scandal had already entered cultural memory. The "hat snatcher" label clung to him like a brand burned into his skin. Within his company, the pressure mounted. Board members held emergency meetings to discuss the damage. Teams scrambled to rebuild trust, launching campaigns focused on community outreach, charitable donations, and child-focused initiatives. But critics quickly saw through the attempts, labeling them as corporate spin. The company's stock took another dip, not catastrophic but enough to signal investors' shaken confidence. For employees, each day became a test of endurance, answering skeptical clients, dealing with public anger, and watching as years of reputation unraveled because of one impulsive act. Privately, the CEO wrestled with conflicting emotions. He insisted to those closest to him that the moment had been misunderstood. In his mind, he had reached out carelessly, not maliciously. But when he watched the video, he saw what the world saw. A man in power, reaching into a child's world and taking something without permission. No matter how he framed it, the optics were damning. His advisors urged him to step back, to let others manage the crisis, but his pride made him resist. He felt that silence had already painted him as weak, and stepping aside would only confirm what people believed. The legal side of the controversy also loomed. The boy's family hinted at possible legal action, not for the hat itself, but for the humiliation inflicted. While no lawsuit had yet been filed, the threat hovered like a storm cloud. Lawyers representing the CEO scrambled to negotiate privately, offering financial compensation and personal gestures to repair the damage. Rumors swirled that he had offered to set up a college fund for the child, though nothing was confirmed publicly. These whispers further divided public opinion. Was this generosity or just an attempt to buy forgiveness? Meanwhile, late-night hosts and comedians seized on the story. Night after night, they turned the incident into jokes, exaggerating the CEO's actions for laughs. He became a running punchline, an easy symbol of arrogance and entitlement. Each mention reignited the controversy, dragging his name back into headlines even as he tried to fade quietly into the background. No press release, no charity campaign, no lawyerly statement could compete with the relentless rhythm of mockery. But amid the chaos, an unexpected group began to rally to his defense. Some colleagues, business leaders, and even a handful of public figures spoke out, insisting that while the act was wrong, the punishment had grown disproportionate. They argued that internet outrage had transformed a single bad decision into a permanent scar, one that could destroy not only the man but also thousands of employees who depended on his company. Their defense did not erase the anger, but it introduced a new layer of complexity. The scandal was no longer just about a hat. It was about power, accountability, forgiveness, and the merciless culture of public shaming. The CEO, for all his flaws, began to see this too. In private conversations, he admitted that the incident had revealed more than just his own mistake. It had revealed how fragile reputations were in an era where a few seconds of video could outweigh decades of work. The incident had turned into something bigger than himself, bigger than his company. He knew that his survival depended not only on repairing his image, but also on addressing the deeper questions the scandal had raised. Still, the future remained uncertain. His apology had broken the silence, but it had not closed the chapter. The world was watching closely, waiting to see if he would stumble again, or if he would somehow find a way to turn disgrace into redemption. In the weeks following the press conference, the CEO lived under a microscope. Every move he made, every word he spoke, was dissected by the public and the media. His life, once defined by control and power, now felt like a stage where he played the unwilling villain. Even casual outings turned into photo opportunities for paparazzi, each headline more biting than the last. Hat snatcher seen at luxury restaurant while boy still waits for justice. One article read, twisting even the most mundane details of his life into ammunition against him. Inside his home, the pressure was unbearable. Family members who had once enjoyed the privileges of his success now felt suffocated by the constant scrutiny. His children faced whispers at school, their classmates repeating jokes they had seen online. His wife, fiercely private, resented the spotlight and the shame that came with it. Arguments filled the house, and what had once been a sanctuary from the corporate world now felt like another battlefield. For the first time in his career, the CEO wondered if the cost of power had finally outgrown its rewards. Meanwhile, his company struggled to maintain stability. Key partners hesitated to renew contracts, worried about the long-term reputational damage. Potential clients withdrew interest, fearing public backlash for associating with him. Internally, morale cracked. Employees, once proud to work under a visionary leader, now questioned his judgment. Whispers about leadership change circulated in hushed tones, and anonymous leaks to the press suggested that some board members were quietly preparing to force his resignation. The walls of his empire, once solid and unshakable, were showing dangerous cracks. In an effort to counter the damage, the CEO launched a personal campaign of atonement. He arranged private meetings with community leaders, reached out to charitable organizations, and initiated programs designed to support children's causes. One high-profile initiative involved funding youth sports programs, presented as a way to encourage fairness and opportunity for kids. Yet every step was met with suspicion. He's only doing this to clean up his image. Critics sneered, dismissing genuine efforts as manipulative strategy. No matter how much he gave, the shadow of the U.S. Open incident loomed larger than his attempts at redemption. The child at the center of the scandal remained a silent figure in the background, shielded by his family. But every mention of his name reignited the outrage. News outlets eagerly revisited the footage, replaying the moment frame by frame as if it were a crime scene. The boy's face, wide-eyed and crushed, became a symbol of innocence stolen. For the CEO, the image haunted him. In interviews, he tried to appear composed, but privately, he confessed to aides that he could not shake the memory. The moment played over in his mind at night, a loop he could not escape. A reminder that his downfall had been caused not by a boardroom blunder, but by one impulsive act in front of the world. Public debate shifted from the incident itself to a broader question: should one mistake define an entire career? Commentators filled television panels, some arguing that accountability was necessary, others suggesting that the internet had created a culture of permanent punishment where no redemption was possible. His story became a case study in ethics classes, a discussion point in leadership seminars, and a symbol of how quickly power could collapse in the digital age. The CEO had become more than a man, he was now a cautionary tale. Yet in the midst of despair, something unexpected happened. A small but growing number of voices began to argue for forgiveness. These were not corporate insiders or wealthy allies, but ordinary people who believed the outrage had gone too far. They pointed out that the child's family had not pursued a lawsuit, that the apology had been made, And that continued mockery was turning into bullying. On forums and comment sections, new conversations emerged. Had the punishment already exceeded the crime? For the CEO, this fragile shift offered a faint glimmer of hope. He knew that winning back trust would take more than time. It would take humility, persistence, and perhaps a willingness to step away from power altogether. The world had branded him as the hat snatcher, but he began to wonder if he could redefine himself not by denying the mistake, but by living in its shadow and showing growth beyond it. Redemption was no longer about erasing the past. It was about building something honest enough to stand beside it. Still, the road ahead was uncertain. The mob had not fully dispersed, and the boardroom's patience was wearing thin. The man who once ruled board meetings with absolute authority now found himself walking into each one with the possibility that it could be his last. His silence had been broken, his apology delivered, but the question still remained unanswered. Could he truly rise again, or was his fate sealed by a single reckless moment on a tennis court? The boardroom meeting that would determine his fate felt less like a business gathering and more like a courtroom. The CEO sat at the long polished table, facing men and women who had once been his staunch allies. Their expressions were cold, their voices sharper than he had ever heard. Reports were laid out before them, graphs showing plummeting stock values, charts outlining customer losses, pages filled with headlines that refused to fade. Every number, every article, every meme was a weapon turned against him. One director leaned forward and spoke plainly. This is no longer about one incident. This is about whether the company survives with you at the helm. Others nodded grimly. For the first time in decades, the CEO found himself pleading, not commanding. He reminded them of his record, the deals he had secured, the empire he had built. But he could see in their eyes that his past victories carried little weight against the shadow of the US Open scandal. They wanted more than apologies, they wanted results, and results had been slipping away. Outside the boardroom, protests occasionally appeared in front of the company's headquarters. Parents carried signs with slogans like "Hands off our kids" and "Leadership without respect is no leadership." Cameras flocked to capture the scenes, ensuring that even a handful of demonstrators became front-page news. Employees, forced to walk past the protests on their way to work, grew more restless. Whispers about resignations turned into actual departures, with some staff members choosing to distance themselves before their RA summations became tainted by association. The CEO's world shrank further when invitations to elite social events stopped arriving. Colleagues who once sought his company now avoided him, unwilling to risk the stain of being photographed at his side. Old friends quietly slipped away. He became a pariah among the powerful, isolated in the very circles where he had once thrived. Alone at night, he sat in his study staring at the glowing screen, scrolling through endless comments that dissected his every move. Some were cruel, others mocking, but the ones that struck hardest were the calm statements. "This man should not lead anymore. He has lost our trust." Despite this, he refused to resign. Pride, stubbornness, and perhaps a belief that stepping down would mean permanent disgrace kept him clinging to his position. He insisted on attending public events, even when advised against it. At one charity gala, he attempted to make a grand gesture, announcing a major donation to children's hospitals. But the moment he stepped on stage, the audience murmured. Some clapped politely, others turned their backs, and one voice shouted, "Give the kid his hat back." The humiliation cut deeper than any headline. Yet amid the ridicule, cracks of empathy still appeared. Editorials in respected newspapers began questioning whether society had turned the man into a scapegoat, punishing him far beyond the scale of his mistake. Commentators debated whether one act, however foolish, should erase a lifetime of achievements. These discussions did not absolve him, but they gave him something he had been desperately lacking: nuance. For the first time, the narrative shifted slightly from ridicule to reflection. Privately, the CEO wrestled with the possibility that his only path forward was to relinquish control. He had built the company from the ground up, but now it seemed that letting go might be the only way to save it. Advisors urged him to consider a temporary step back, allowing a trusted deputy to take over while he worked on repairing his personal image. It was a bitter suggestion, but deep down, he knew they were right. His presence had become the lightning rod. The company would not heal while he remained at its head. In the quiet of his office, late one evening, he drafted a resignation letter. The words came slowly, each sentence heavy with finality. He wrote of accountability, of lessons learned, and of his commitment to ensuring the company thrived without him. He did not mention the hat or the boy directly, but every line was haunted by that moment. Saying his name felt like surrendering a part of himself he had fought all his life to protect. But even as he prepared to step down, he felt a strange clarity. The scandal had stripped him of power, friends, and prestige, yet it had also revealed truths he could not ignore. He understood, perhaps for the first time, the fragility of reputation and the brutal speed with which judgment could fall. His fall from grace was undeniable, but whether it would define him forever, or become the beginning of something unexpected, remained uncertain. The morning of his resignation announcement was gray and heavy with rain, as if the sky itself mirrored the weight pressing down on him. The CEO arrived at the headquarters earlier than usual, his steps echoing through the empty halls. For years, he had walked these corridors with authority, greeted by staff who saw him as untouchable. Now, he moved like a man stripped bare, aware that each passing second drew him closer to the moment he had once sworn would never come. Stepping aside. The press conference was packed, reporters crammed shoulder to shoulder, cameras flashing, microphones poised to capture every word. Employees stood in the back, their faces anxious, some hopeful, others simply tired. The CEO approached the podium, his tailored suit damp from the rain outside, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edges. For a moment, he scanned the crowd and thought of how far he had fallen. He was no longer the commanding figure who negotiated billion-dollar deals, but the man branded across the world as the hat snatcher. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, stripped of its practiced polish. He admitted that his actions at the U.S. Open had been careless and disrespectful. He acknowledged the pain caused to the child and the embarrassment inflicted on his family. More importantly, he admitted that his silence and defensive posture in the aftermath had only deepened the wound. "For too long, I clung to pride instead of humility," he said, pausing as flashes lit the room. "And in doing so, I failed not only a child, but also the thousands of people who placed their trust in me as a leader." The room fell silent. For the first time, his words felt less like scripted damage control and more like raw truth. He announced his resignation effective immediately, promising to step away so the company could rebuild without his shadow hanging over it. He pledged ongoing support for children's charities and announced a permanent scholarship fund in the boy's name, a gesture that seemed to come less from corporate strategy and more from personal remorse. The statement sparked immediate headlines worldwide. Some applauded the decision, praising it as a long overdue act of accountability. Others dismissed it as too little, too late. But one thing was undeniable. The man who had once symbolized arrogance and entitlement had finally shown a measure of humility. The hat snatcher narrative remained, but it was now accompanied by a quieter, more complicated story, one of downfall, admission, and the possibility of redemption. In the weeks that followed, the company began to stabilize. Freed from the controversy tied to its former leader, it slowly regained the trust of customers and partners. Employees, relieved to move forward, threw themselves into rebuilding. The boy's family, while never fully forgiving, acknowledged the gesture of the scholarship fund. calling it a step in the right direction. The child, shielded from most of the chaos, was able to return to his normal life, though his face, captured in that viral clip, would remain etched in cultural memory. For the CEO, life shifted dramatically. The private jets, gala invitations, and boardroom power plays vanished. In their place came long days of reflection, quiet walks away from flashing cameras, and the slow work of redefining himself outside the empire he once commanded. Some said he had been ruined forever, that he would never escape the stain of the scandal. Others believed he had a chance to build something new, smaller, more meaningful, away from the glare of relentless judgment. He himself did not know which future awaited. What he did know was that the boy's disappointed face, replayed millions of times across the world, had become the turning point of his life. That single moment had cost him everything, but it had painful but necessary understanding of humility. The scandal that began with a stolen hat at the US Open had ended with the fall of a CEO, but in its wreckage lay a warning for the world. That power is fragile, arrogance is costly, and sometimes the smallest actions can cast the longest shadows. Whether history remembered him as a villain, a fool, or a man who learned too late, one fact would never change: the boy's hat had changed everything. Months after his resignation, the scandal had begun to fade from daily headlines, but its ripples continued shaping lives in subtle, lasting ways. The company he once led slowly regained stability under new leadership, its reputation cautiously rebuilt by distance from his name. Investors, once skeptical, returned as quarterly reports showed signs of recovery. Employees who had endured the darkest period finally breathed easier, no longer carrying the weight of explaining their leaders' actions at every turn. The shadow of the US Open incident lingered, but it no longer consumed the company's every breath. The former CEO, however, lived in a different reality. Out of the spotlight, he discovered what anonymity felt like after decades of living under scrutiny. At first, the silence was unbearable. The ringing phones, packed schedules, and constant demands of corporate life had been replaced by long stretches of quiet, without the power he had once wielded so effortlessly. For a man who had defined himself through authority, the emptiness was disorienting. Yet in that emptiness, he began to rediscover pieces of himself,